I'm going to talk about, I'll explain what we're doing and talk about myself a little bit and get us all organized. But before we even do anything, I want to do a little exercise together. So sit up straight, whatever is straight for you. And for this exercise, it doesn't matter where you put your hands. You can keep your eyes open or closed, whatever is comfortable. You're going to breathe just through your nose, so in your nose and out of your nose. Okay, it doesn't really, it's not so important to breathe deeply. You don't have to control this too much. But when you breathe in, you breathe in, and when you breathe out, I want you to think one. And just hold on to that one the whole time until you get to the very end of the breath. And then you breathe in again. And when you breathe out, you think two. And that's as far as we're going to take it. So after you finish two, go back to one. And if you, it sounds like you can't lose track, but you can. If you lose track, go back to one. That's all you have to do. Okay? So we'll take a couple minutes. Just breathe and just follow one and two and one and two. We're going to go back to that. But it's the beginning of a frame of reference for the larger conversation that we're going to have tonight. It's also nice because now we're all on the same footing. My name is Koun Franz. I'll talk a little bit about myself this time and then never again. I was born and raised in Montana, where, as you can imagine, there are Buddhists everywhere. And I came to Buddhism mostly through reading as a teenager. There was a small used bookstore in our town, and there was a small section of that small used bookstore that had a mishmash of books related to Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism. They were all categorized as one thing, and I just devoured that section of the bookstore. And I had no idea what to do with that. And then soon after graduating from high school, I was speaking with my former English teacher and telling him how interested I was in Buddhism. And he revealed to me that actually there was a Buddhist group in my town, but it was the Fight Club version. The first rule of this group was that you don't talk about this group. And we would all meet in someone's office or in someone's garage, and people would shuffle in, and they would sit down, and they would face the wall, and there was a bell, and they would meditate, and when it was done, they'd get up, and they'd all walk back out, and nobody ever talked to anybody. And I remember, especially in the beginning, these kind of awkward moments in the supermarket when you bump into someone, and you think, I think I sat next to that person, you know, and they're thinking the same thing. Do you acknowledge this person? It's very, we've come a long way in the last 20 years, I think, but it was all very underground at that time. And after college, I went to Japan, not to pursue Buddhism, though I hoped that I could, but just because that was something that people do sometimes, and they get a job, they don't work very hard, and it's an adventure, and it's exciting. So I thought I would try that. And I looked everywhere for 2 years. I looked for Buddhist practice, and specifically for Zen practice. And I was in a fairly large city, and there were lots of Zen temples, but they were not at all what we would expect. They were places that performed a lot of funerals, they had community functions, they did memorial services, and I would say, well, where's the meditation practice? And they'd say, oh, you have to go someplace else for that, but they couldn't tell me where. So I came home from Japan after 2 years, and I thought, there's nothing there. Japan is a dead end. But I liked Japan, and I liked the language, and I liked the people, and I found myself going back there a few years later. And this time I got a job in a really small town that's actually inside the caldera of a volcano. It was very cool. And the very first day that I was there, I heard temple bells. And so I asked someone at work, and they said, oh yeah, it's the Zen temple. It's kind of roughly over there. So the next morning I got up, and I got on my bicycle, and I waited. And when I heard the bells, I started going toward the bells and going toward the bells. And I got there, and there was this little tiny man in overalls, and he had a haircut like mine. And I said, is this a Zen temple? And this is all in terrible Japanese. And he said, yes. And I said, do you do Zazen, which is the meditation? And he said, of course we do. And I said, when? And he said, when do you want to come? And so I arranged, and I went the next morning, and he was ready for me, and he was wearing these really fancy robes, and they lit incense, and we meditated, and then when it was done, his wife brought out this very traditional meal for me, and they took me to the door, and they were saying goodbye, and I said, well, so can I come back tomorrow? Which they did not think was the point at all. They said, oh, yeah, I guess. And the show diminished over time, and the robes got less fancy over time, and the meals got simpler over time, and eventually I kind of became staff, and I would show up and I would sit, and then I would go on and clean the grounds, and then I would just go into their kitchen and help with breakfast, and we'd all eat breakfast together, and I did that for 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, then, I was ordained. Still with very little understanding of what that might mean for me, except that I knew I wanted this practice to somehow be central in my life, and ordination felt like a way to commit to doing that. And part of the deal was that I would have to go to a monastery, so I went to a monastery. And I'll talk about that more as we progress, but it really changed my understanding of what I was doing in a lot of ways. So that's something I want to go back to. But in any case, it was a very powerful experience for me, and it led to me eventually going to Alaska for 4 years, where there was a fairly large Zen community, and living with them and working with them, and then eventually, kind of indirectly, it brought me to Halifax, which is a place that I actually had to look up on a map the first time the opportunity arose. Now I've been here about 1.5 years, and we have a group here in town called, very poetically, Zen Nova Scotia. And we meet on Tuesday nights, and we're a little over 1 year old. It's not so underground, but maybe not so well known. So we thought that one thing that we could do to kind of, to reach out a little bit beyond what we ordinarily do would be to offer something like this, so that people can come and you're not walking into a dark room where a bunch of people are meditating, and there's no incense, and it's a little bit less threatening maybe than it could be. And the other thing is that on Tuesday nights, when I speak, it's a little bit more formal. And what I would really like to do, and I think sometimes it's hard for people, but I'd really like to make this a discussion-based class. So I have what kind of passes for a curriculum here. But this is not, it's not a curriculum, it's that I have 20 pages of things that I think are worth talking about. And in 4 weeks, we can't even begin to scratch the surface of the question, what is Buddhism? We'll just cover what we cover. But that means that it's really up to you. And if you have questions along the way, please stop me, please raise your hand. Just interject. If you want to steer this toward philosophy, we'll go toward philosophy. If you want to know about robes, we'll go toward robes. We'll take this in whatever direction you want to go. All good? Okay. I'm really happy to have people here. Part 1. Who was the Buddha? Yes. Siddhartha or Siddhartha. There's always, you get a lot of passive-aggressive kind of Sanskrit conversations going with people where they try. I'm not sure. The Buddha died in, it really depends. We're still, it's funny, just a year ago a new scholarly thing came out suggesting that we've been completely wrong about the Buddha by 100 years or 150 years, something like that. It's remarkable to think that we get just a little bit, we get into the BC zone and find that there's very little we can track with real accuracy. But what we do know about the Buddha was that he's an historical person. There's really no debate about the fact that someone existed at that time who came from kind of the upper classes in India of the time, though he was born in what is now Nepal. And we can track that he traveled in certain areas and that he had a certain following of people who considered him to be a spiritual leader, and that following of people grew into the institution that continues to be the kind of the ordained, what we call Sangha, of Buddhist monks and nuns. We know that he was there. That's really all we know. We don't know what he said. There's lots of written teachings that are ascribed to the Buddha, but nothing was written down for a long, 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 long time, as is often the case with religious traditions. And so when someone actually put pen to paper, it was generations removed from the Buddha. So did he really say that? For some people, it's really important to believe that he really did say those things. For other people, it's really not an issue. Maybe the larger question, even stepping back further, is did he do what he said he did? Which is to say, did he realize some sort of enlightenment or some sort of awakening? I don't know about that either. And I feel like I always need to put that out there first. Maybe. He could have been a great con artist. It's possible. It's always possible. But for me personally, because I've met a lot of extraordinary people through this tradition, and they talk about the extraordinary people that they met when they were younger, and so on and so on and so on, that even if the whole thing was based on a lie, at some point I think it righted itself, and some transformative practices were born out of this group of people. So I'm not really too concerned about how the whole thing got kicked off. He was the story of the Buddha. very quickly was he was born a prince. You've probably all heard this. And here we step away from history and into myth, but it's a great story. The Buddha was born a prince. And when he was born, it was foretold that he would either become a great spiritual leader or a great ruler of men. And his father, who was a king, was not at all comfortable with the idea of spiritual leader as a career path for his son. And we have to cut, I think, the fathers a lot of slack, because we only know what we know. Right? And he could be very hopeful for his son that his son would step into his own shoes and inhabit a life that was something like his own life. But this possibility that he might go and do something that is completely foreign, it's terrifying to parents. So he decided that he would try to kind of rig the game a little bit. And the way that he did this, which is very insightful because it means that he was no dummy about spiritual matters at all, was that he tried to shelter his son from images of suffering. He thought, these are the things, it's when someone close to you dies, it's when someone close to you is sick, these are the events in your life that cause you to start asking the big questions. And I don't really want my son asking those questions. So, I'm going to keep everything really clean. I'm going to keep everything fun. Everything's, he'll always have great playmates, and there will be a lot of dancing going on. And when he gets older, we'll make sure that he does not lack for dates. And he'll eat all his favorite foods when he wants, and he won't ever have these questions of why. And that meant that he had to be kind of locked inside the palace. Well, he wanted to go out. He really wanted to go out. He knew there was more to it than what he was seeing. So they arranged for him to go out. And when they did, they basically put the whole city on lockdown in the very disturbing way that we hear about even today when, there's a summit somewhere and suddenly all the homeless people they disappear for a couple weeks. That's what they did in this city. And the idea was that he would be able to go by on an elephant or, and see the town and realize that it was just like his own life, and he would go home. But it's hard to control these things, especially 2,500 years ago. And so he stumbled upon he had four encounters, four visions. He saw someone who was sick. And usually the way the story is told is he saw someone who had leprosy. And I think we probably tell it that way simply because it has to be graphic. It has to be something that he could recognize from a distance as sickness. So he encountered sickness. And then he stumbled upon someone who was very, very old. And he'd never seen that before, because he had not been allowed to witness the process of aging to that extent. And this blew his mind. And then he saw someone who was dead, which the first time I heard the story sounded so improbable, because I've been walking around for 42 years and I've never just stumbled upon a dead person. But it's India. And in fact, in India, you still do. There are funeral pyres, there are outdoor processions. It's really very easy to see that sight. And as he's seeing these things, he's asking his attendant, what is this? And his attendant says, well, that's sickness, that's old age, that's death. And he says, well, why is it there? And the response every time is, well, everyone is subject to this. Everyone gets sick. Everyone grows old. Everyone dies. Totally new information. At the end of the day, as he's heading home, he sees someone in the distance who is an ascetic, someone who has dedicated his life completely to spiritual practice. And you still see this in India as well. You see people who either have the very, very, they haven't cut their hair for 10 years, or they keep it shaved. Often their faces are painted. They've renounced secular life, and they've taken up some sort of practices in pursuit of some different kind of understanding. And he asked his attendant again, he was like, what the heck is that? What is that person doing? And he got the explanation. It shook his foundations. So he went home. And he resolved that this human condition, wherein we all know that we're going to get sick, and we're going to grow old, and we're going to die, and that that's just the way it is too much, and that he needed to resolve it. And he thought about how to do it, and how to do it, and how to do it. And finally he decided he had to leave, and he had to become one of these people that he had seen. That was the only option B that he thought was being presented to him. He was married, and he had just had a child. Lot of debate today about how we would view him today, ditching his family, but he did. He snuck out in the middle of the night. He walked right past his wife and his newborn son, and he went out of the palace gates, and he disappeared into the forest, and began this process of a few years in which he undertook various ascetic practices and studied with the teachers of the time, many of whom, to oversimplify it, were trying to achieve spiritual understanding through transcendence of the body. That was a very common frame for what it meant to be a spiritual person, that the body was the problem. And you can imagine, given the questions that got him there, that would have made a lot of sense. Like, oh, the problem is simply that I have a human body. That's the thing that gets sick. That's the thing that grows old. That's the thing that dies. I'm going to get over it. So he became fairly fanatic about this. And eventually he was the guy who was known as the most hardcore ascetic of the woods. And people kind of gathered around him, and his hair was really long. I always assumed he had kind of crazy dreadlocks. And often depictions of him from this time, he's completely emaciated because he's living off of almost nothing. And what people would do is they would sit, they would meditate, but it had to be painful, right? There had to be something to go beyond. So you'd sit on things that were sharp, for example, thorns or dried branches, and you would take care of your natural processes where you were, so that you could transcend your disgust of those as well. So you're just wallowing in your own humanity, you know. And a few feet away, there's your friend who's doing the same thing, and this went on for a very long time, and he got very close to death. And here the story kind of is told in different ways, but he found himself, one version is that he heard some music and was drawn to the music, and he went and found himself near a river, and in his kind of dying state, let himself fall into the water. And when he did, then he was washed clean, and he drank some water, and then someone came along and found him and offered him a little bit of some kind of rice or something like that. And he felt renewed, and in that feeling discovered or came to the personal realization that it wasn't about extremes. And it was from this moment that we hear this teaching about the middle way, that he had now experienced the extremes of decadence and pleasure, and he had experienced the extremes of self-mortification, and so he was going to find something in the middle. It certainly wasn't on either end. He hadn't found what he was looking for. So he cleaned himself up, and he put on some sort of minimal clothing, and he ate a real meal. And he went back to his friends and he said, "Guys, I had the biggest idea." And they looked at him with such contempt, and they said, "You are a sellout. You're a loser. Get out of here. We'll never speak to you again, you pathetic man." So he went and he found a tree, and he sat down beneath this tree, and he resolved, he said, "I am not going to get up until I finally find the answers that I'm looking for." And he sat down, and depending on who tells the story, he either sat all night for a night, or he sat, in many cases, 3 nights, or a week. Getting less probable as we go. But that one morning, well wait, I forgot the exciting part of the story, which is that now we have this new character who comes in, who's named Mara. And Mara is kind of the anti-enlightenment character of the world, kind of a devil, but not in the way that we might usually picture. Not someone who's torturing people in hell, but someone who is distracting, who doesn't want you to see things clearly. He benefits, and we'll talk about this later too, but Mara benefits tremendously from you not seeing things as they really are. So Mara tries to distract him, and says, first of all, it's kind of taunting Buddha, and saying, "You can't do it. No one's ever done it. You're not going to do it." And Buddha says, "Shut up, I'm going to do it." And then, at one point, he gathers up armies, and they're shooting arrows at the ground. And this is it's a fun story to tell kids. And then as the arrows are coming and they're landing, just as they're about to get to them, they turn to flowers and drop them. Because the world is on his side at this point. And then Mara has some daughters that are distracting daughters, because that's what they do. And the daughters come. And in multiple tellings of the story, this is actually in some ways the toughest one. They're really very distracting. And he finally manages to kind of get his equilibrium again and says, "No, I need to focus." Then they disappear. And finally, something happens. He sees something. And it would be completely ridiculous of me to sit here and say, and fill in the blank, this is what he saw. He saw something. But he termed this realization. This was his enlightenment. And he got up and he was really excited. I got it. And Mara is still watching, and Mara sees his chance, his big chance. And he goes up and he kind of puts an arm around Buddha and he says, "Hey, you win. You did a good job. But here's the thing." He says, "You can't explain this to anybody. Nothing you can say will make sense of what you just did. People won't even believe you. Here's what you do. Leave it all behind. You're so close, all you have to do is kind of wish it, and you can disappear from the material plane, and you'll be free." And the story goes, the Buddha he paced around on this hill for a while, trying to think, what would I say to explain this to somebody? And he has no idea. It's too big. And so he almost says, "You're right, this is beyond me." But then he kind of comes to his senses again, and he says, "No, somebody might understand a little bit. And just that would be worth it." So he takes off walking back to where his friends were. Now he's 35 years old. And this is my favorite part of the story. He's walking, and his friends see him way off in the distance. They see this new, clean guy coming toward them. And from a distance they say, "Oh, here comes that sellout." So when he comes, don't even look at him. Don't talk to him. No matter what he does, just ignore him. Just ignore him. We're going to pretend he's not even there. and he's still coming. And they're still kind of watching him. And without saying anything to the other people in the group, there are 4 of them, they all change their mind based on how he's carrying himself, which is something they've never seen before, in him or in anyone. And by the time he arrives and he stands there, each one of them is ready to become his student without him having said anything at all. That's beautiful.